Who is Diane Carter? I asked myself as I stared at the glowing screen, and in that moment, a question I couldn't answer began unraveling a marriage that had lasted 35 years. I never intended to look at Thomas's email that evening. The truth is, I was sitting at our kitchen island in Connecticut, finishing a cup of decaf coffee while he was outside trimming the hedges. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of sprinklers running across our neighbor's lawn. His tablet had lit up beside me with a notification banner. Normally, I would have looked away. After all, Thomas and I had spent decades building a relationship on trust. But something about the subject line caught my attention. It mentioned a recurring transfer. I glanced down. Then I looked again. For $1,000. The amount seemed almost unreal. At first, I assumed it had something to do with an investment account or a business matter. Thomas had always handled most of our finances. But when I opened the email, I saw the same payment listed month after month. For $1,000. Every month. Sent to the same person. Diane Carter. I felt the warmth leave my coffee cup as my fingers tightened around it. The name meant nothing to me. I searched my memory. No neighbor. No cousin. No family friend. No one I had ever heard Thomas mention. I stared at the transaction history, noticing that the transfers stretched back much farther than I expected. Not one payment. Not two. A pattern. A commitment. The kind of commitment people don't make by accident. The back door opened. I quickly set the tablet down. Thomas stepped inside carrying gardening gloves and smiling as if it were any ordinary evening. For a brief second, I considered saying nothing, but the question escaped before I could stop it. Who's Diane Carter? His smile disappeared so quickly it almost frightened me. Not because he looked angry, because he looked surprised, caught off guard. The expression lasted less than a second before he recovered. "Why do you ask?" he said casually. I nodded toward the tablet. I saw an email about a transfer. He walked over immediately and picked up the device. Too quickly. Far too quickly. "Just something related to work," he said. Then he locked the screen and set it face down. Work. The answer sounded rehearsed. Thomas had been retired for nearly 4 years. I said nothing. Neither did he. For a moment, the kitchen felt strangely small despite its wide windows and high ceilings. Eventually, he changed the subject and asked what I wanted for dinner. I answered automatically. We ate grilled chicken and salad at the dining table we had purchased on our 20th anniversary. We talked about the weather. We talked about our grandson's baseball game. We talked about everything except Diane Carter. But I noticed something that night. Every time his phone vibrated, he glanced at it immediately. Every time I looked in his direction, he seemed distracted. And for the first time in years, I found myself studying my husband instead of simply being comfortable beside him. Later, after he had gone upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen. The dishes were clean. The counters were spotless. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet nothing felt the same. I opened my laptop and typed the name into a search bar. Diane Carter. I expected nothing. Instead, a photograph appeared. A smiling woman standing in front of a large waterfront home. Well-dressed, confident, successful, not someone who appeared to need help from anyone. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I looked back toward the staircase where Thomas had disappeared. I still didn't know who Diane Carter was. But deep down, I already knew one thing. My husband had lied to me, and that was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, something I had not done in years. The house was still dark. Thomas was asleep beside me, breathing steadily, completely unaware that I was lying there staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. I kept hearing his voice from the night before, just something related to work. The explanation made less sense every time I replayed it. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal that had gone cold. Across from me sat the empty chair Thomas usually occupied while reading the news on his tablet. He eventually came downstairs, kissed the top of my head, poured himself coffee, and acted exactly as he always had. That was what unsettled me the most. Nothing about his behavior suggested guilt. Nothing suggested concern. It was as if the conversation about Diane Carter had never happened. For years, I would have accepted that. I would have convinced myself I was overthinking. But something had shifted inside me. Once trust cracks, even slightly, ordinary moments begin to look different. After breakfast, Thomas left to meet a friend for golf. I watched his car disappear down the street before opening my laptop again. I told myself I was only looking for reassurance. I wanted to find a simple explanation that would make me feel foolish for worrying. Instead, I found more questions. Diane Carter appeared to live a comfortable life. Public records showed ownership of valuable property. There were photographs of charity events, business gatherings, and community fundraisers. She did not appear to be struggling. She certainly did not look like someone dependent on monthly support. I studied every image I could find. There was something strangely familiar about her face, though I could not place it. Around noon, I opened an old storage closet in the hallway. Inside were photo albums, tax folders, and boxes we had carried through 3 different homes during our marriage. Dust covered the lids. I sat on the floor and began sorting through them. Hours passed. Most of what I found was ordinary. Vacation photos, Christmas cards, school pictures of our son, receipts from long-forgotten purchases. Then I found a worn envelope tucked between 2 albums. It contained photographs from years before Thomas and I met. I had seen some of them before. College friends, family gatherings, young faces smiling at old cameras. And there she was, Diane Carter. Younger, of course, but unmistakably the same woman, standing beside Thomas with her hand resting on his shoulder. My heart sank. I already knew she was connected to his past. Seeing the photograph made it real. I turned the picture over. A date was written on the back in faded ink. It had been taken less than a year before Thomas and Diane divorced. I sat there for a long time, staring at that image. Not because it proved anything. It did not. Former spouses remain connected for many reasons. Mature people move on. Life is complicated, but the photograph confirmed something important. Thomas had recognized the name immediately. He knew exactly who she was, and yet he chose not to tell me. Late that afternoon, I carefully returned everything to the boxes. I heard Thomas's car pulling into the driveway. I slid the photograph into my sweater pocket and closed the closet door. As I walked toward the kitchen, I made a decision. I was not going to confront him again. Not yet. Questions rarely reveal the truth when someone is determined to hide it. Evidence does. And for the first time, I began to suspect that whatever I was looking at had started long before I ever noticed that email. Over the next few days, I became someone I barely recognized. Not because I was angry, because I was paying attention. For years, Thomas and I had moved through life with the comfort of routine. We knew each other's habits so well that most days passed without surprises. Now every small detail seemed sharper. Every silence felt heavier. Every explanation sounded carefully measured. On Tuesday morning, he left the house at exactly 8:15, wearing the same navy golf jacket he always wore when meeting friends. I watched from the front window until his car disappeared around the corner. Then I sat down at my desk and opened a notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote a single name, Diane Carter. It felt ridiculous at first, like something from a television drama instead of real life. Yet the moment my pen touched the paper, I realized I could not stop. I began writing down everything I knew, which was almost nothing. Wealthy, connected to Thomas's past, recipient of monthly payments. That was all. By lunchtime, I decided to call my closest friend, Margaret Hayes. Margaret and I had known each other for more than 20 years. She was practical, intelligent, and rarely overreacted. If anyone could help me see clearly, it was her. We met at a small cafe near the town. Green. I told her everything. The transfers, the photograph, the explanation Thomas had given me. Margaret listened quietly. When I finished, she stirred her coffee and looked at me for a long moment. Evelyn, she said gently, if it were truly innocent, why would he hide it? The question followed me home. That evening, Thomas seemed unusually cheerful. He talked about a restaurant he wanted to try. He mentioned a weekend trip we should take during the fall. He smiled often. Too often. It was as though he sensed distance growing between us and was trying to close it without addressing the reason. I smiled back when necessary. I nodded at the right moments. But inside, I felt myself stepping further away. Not emotionally, strategically. The following afternoon, Margaret called. Her voice carried an excitement I had not heard in years. She had found something. A newspaper article from several years earlier. Diane had been featured in a local business magazine after selling a company for a substantial amount of money. The article described her as financially successful and highly respected. I read every word twice, then 3 times. There it was in black and white. Diane was not struggling. She was not dependent. She was not someone who appeared to need assistance from anyone. The question that had been bothering me since that first email became impossible to ignore. Why would Thomas send thousands of dollars every month to a woman who already seemed wealthier than most people we knew? That night, I lay awake listening to the soft sound of rain tapping against the bedroom windows. Thomas slept peacefully beside me. I turned toward the darkness and stared at the outline of the dresser across the room. Something was missing from the story. I could feel it. The money was important, but it was not the entire truth. People do not maintain secrets for years without a reason. Somewhere beneath those transfers was an explanation Thomas had worked very hard to keep hidden. The next morning, while sorting old financial records in the basement, I found a document that made my stomach tighten. The transfers had not begun 7 years ago as I first suspected. They had started nearly a decade earlier. I sat at the basement workbench with the document spread out in front of me. Dust floated through the narrow beam of light coming from the small window above. For a moment, I simply stared at the numbers. 10 years. Not 7. Not 8. 10 years. The transfers had begun almost a decade earlier and had continued with remarkable consistency. Month after month, year after year, I ran my finger down the page, tracing the dates as if touching them might somehow change them. They did not. The pattern remained. Precise, deliberate, hidden. I leaned back in the chair and tried to remember what life looked like 10 years ago. Thomas and I had celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary that year. We had taken a trip to Maine. We had spent evenings planning retirement. We had talked about growing older together. At least, I thought we had. Suddenly those memories felt different. Not ruined, just altered, like photographs viewed through cracked glass. That evening, I prepared dinner as usual. Roasted chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. Thomas complimented the meal and asked about my day. I answered politely. Then I listened. For the first time, I noticed how carefully he discussed certain subjects and how quickly he moved away from others. When finances came up, he changed topics. When future plans were mentioned, he became vague. None of it would have stood out before. Now it felt impossible to ignore. After dinner, he settled into his favorite chair and watched a baseball game. I sat nearby with a book open in my lap. I did not read a single page. Instead, I watched him from the corner of my eye. This was the same man who had held my hand through difficult years. The same man who had comforted me when my father passed away. The same man who knew how I took my coffee and which songs made me cry. Yet somehow there was a part of his life I knew nothing about. A part large enough to carry a secret for 10 years. The following morning, I called Margaret again. She listened quietly as I explained what I had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, she said something I had been unwilling to admit to myself. Evelyn, people do not hide something for a decade unless it matters a great deal to them. Her words stayed with me all day. That afternoon, I returned to my research. Public records, old articles, archived announcements. I searched patiently, refusing to jump to conclusions. Then I found something unexpected. Nearly 10 years earlier, around the same time the payments began, Diane Carter had experienced a major business setback. Several articles mentioned legal disputes and financial uncertainty surrounding one of her companies. The details were complicated, but one fact stood out. The timing matched perfectly. I stared at the screen. Could that be the reason? Had Thomas simply helped someone from his past during a difficult period? It was the first explanation that seemed almost reasonable. I wanted to believe it. I truly did. But as I continued reading, another detail appeared. Within 2 years, Diane had fully recovered and gone on to achieve even greater success than before. Yet the payments never stopped. I closed the laptop slowly. Whatever agreement had begun 10 years ago should have ended long ago. Instead, it continued in silence. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the money itself was only a symptom of something much larger. For the next week, I stopped looking for explanations that would make me feel better. Instead, I focused on facts. Facts did not care about feelings. Facts did not soften themselves to protect a marriage. They simply existed. Margaret introduced me to a retired accountant she trusted, a quiet man named Richard Bennett, who occasionally reviewed financial records for friends and local businesses. I did not tell him everything. I simply asked whether someone could hide recurring transfers inside a larger financial picture without drawing attention. He smiled sadly. "Easier than most people think," he said. A few days later, I gathered copies of statements I could legally access. Retirement accounts, joint savings, investment summaries. I spread them across my dining room table while Thomas attended a charity event. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. The transfers themselves were not the only issue. Small amounts had been moved between accounts over the years. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately raise suspicion. But together they created a pattern. Money flowed quietly from one place to another until it eventually reached the same destination. I sat there for hours with a calculator, a notebook, and growing disbelief. By sunset, one number stood out above all the others. More than $300,000 had left our shared financial world over the course of a decade. I stared at the total until the digits blurred. $300,000. That amount represented years of planning. Vacations we postponed. Home improvements we delayed. Gifts we chose not to buy. Decisions we made together because we believed we were protecting our future. Suddenly those sacrifices looked different. When Thomas returned home that evening, he seemed relaxed. He carried a small bakery box containing my favorite lemon pastries. Years ago, that gesture would have melted my frustration instantly. This time I thanked him and placed the box on the counter untouched. He noticed. I could tell, but he said nothing. Neither did I. The silence between us was changing shape. It was no longer comfortable. It was becoming crowded with things neither of us wanted to discuss. 2 days later, another unexpected piece of information arrived. Margaret called just after lunch. Her voice was unusually serious. She had spoken with someone who remembered Diane from years earlier. Nothing scandalous, nothing dramatic, just a detail that refused to leave my mind. According to that source, Diane and Thomas had remained in contact long after their divorce. Not occasionally, consistently. Holiday cards, phone calls, friendly lunches when schedules allowed. I lowered myself into a chair and closed my eyes. Thomas had always described that chapter of his life as completely finished. A distant memory, ancient history. Yet history does not exchange holiday cards for decades. History does not require monthly payments. History does not remain hidden this carefully. That night, after Thomas went to bed, I sat alone on the back porch. The air was cool. Crickets filled the darkness. I looked. Across the yard we had spent years maintaining together and wondered how many other truths were buried beneath the life I thought I knew. Then my phone vibrated. It was a message from Margaret. Only one sentence. She had found the address where Diane lived, and it was less than 40 miles from our house. The address stayed on my phone screen long after Margaret ended the call. Less than 40 miles away. I kept reading the number and street name as if distance alone could explain what had been happening. For 10 years, I had imagined Diane as a figure from Thomas's past, someone who existed in old photographs and forgotten memories. Now she lived close enough to reach in under an hour. Close enough that any meeting could happen without attracting attention. Close enough that a routine afternoon drive would never seem unusual. The next morning, I told Thomas the first was spending the day shopping and meeting friends. He barely looked up from his coffee. "Sounds good," he said. Then he smiled and returned to reading the newspaper. I watched him for a moment. There was a time when that smile would have reassured me. Now I wondered how many secrets existed behind it. The drive took 47 minutes. Connecticut roads wound through quiet neighborhoods lined with mature trees and carefully maintained lawns. As I followed the navigation instructions, my hands remained steady on the steering wheel. I was not there to confront anyone. I was there to understand. The address led to a beautiful waterfront neighborhood. Large homes, private docks, expansive windows facing the water. The kind of area where success was visible without anyone needing to talk about it. I parked across the street and sat quietly inside my car. Diane's house was larger than ours. Fresh landscaping surrounded the property. 2 luxury vehicles sat in the driveway. Nothing about the place suggested financial hardship. Nothing suggested a woman who depended on monthly support. After several minutes, the front door opened. A woman stepped outside carrying a tote bag. Even from a distance, I recognized her immediately from the photographs I had seen online. Diane Carter. She looked confident, comfortable, entirely at ease in her surroundings. I expected resentment, perhaps jealousy. Instead, I felt confusion. She did not look like someone hiding anything. She did not look like someone taking advantage of another person. She simply looked like a woman living her life. Then something happened that I still replay in my mind. A second vehicle pulled into the driveway. My heart immediately jumped. For one terrifying second, I thought it might be Thomas. It was not. An older man stepped out and greeted Diane warmly. They appeared familiar with one another. Comfortable. Happy. They walked inside together. I sat there stunned. If Diane had her own successful life and her own relationships, why was Thomas still connected to her after all these years? The question only grew larger. On the drive home, I realized something important. Every assumption I had made so far might be wrong. Perhaps Diane was not the architect of the secret. Perhaps she was simply part of it. That evening, Thomas returned from running errands and casually mentioned stopping by the bank. The comment caught my attention immediately. I kept my expression neutral. Anything important? I asked. Just routine paperwork, he replied. Then he walked upstairs. Routine paperwork. The words lingered in my mind. Later that night, unable to sleep, I logged into one of our shared financial portals. There, buried among ordinary account activity, I noticed something new. A scheduled appointment had been added to Thomas's calendar earlier that day. The meeting was not with a banker. It was with an estate planning attorney. The appointment with the estate planning attorney changed everything. Until that moment, I had been investigating a secret. Now I had reason to believe the secret was still growing. I spent the next morning sitting at my kitchen table, staring out at the backyard while a light breeze moved through the maple trees. Thomas was upstairs. I could hear him walking from room to room, completely unaware that I knew about the meeting. For the first time since this began, I stopped asking why. Instead, I started asking what comes next. People do not schedule estate planning meetings by accident, especially not people who have spent 10 years moving money in silence. That afternoon, I called Margaret. She listened carefully, then gave me the name of an attorney she trusted, Andrew Collins. He specialized in estate and financial matters. I made an appointment for the following day. Walking into his office felt strange. I had never imagined discussing my marriage with a lawyer. Yet as I sat across from him and explained the situation, his expression remained calm and professional. He asked questions: dates, financial records, account structures, property ownership. I answered as best I could. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked directly at me. Evelyn, before you assume anything, gather facts. Documents tell stories that people often do not. The advice sounded simple. It also sounded wise. Over the next several days, I followed it. Quietly, methodically, I organized account statements, property records, retirement summaries, insurance documents. The more information I collected, the clearer the overall picture became. Thomas had always maintained careful control over certain financial matters. Not enough to raise concern, just enough to avoid questions. Then Andrew called. His voice carried a seriousness that immediately made my stomach tighten. He had reviewed some of the documents I provided. Nothing illegal appeared on the surface. However, he noticed several recent changes involving beneficiary designations and asset structures. Changes made within the past 18 months. Changes I had never been told about. I felt cold despite the warm afternoon sunlight coming through the window. What kind of changes? I asked. There was a brief pause. The kind people often make when they are reorganizing how assets will eventually be distributed. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Distributed. The word echoed inside my head. That evening, Thomas suggested we go out for dinner. A year ago, I would have been delighted. Instead, I spent the entire meal studying him. The way he smiled, the way he discussed future travel plans, the way he spoke about retirement projects as though everything between us remained exactly the same. I wondered whether he felt guilty. I wondered whether he believed he was protecting me, or perhaps he simply believed I would never discover the truth. 2 days later, Andrew contacted me again. This time his tone was even more careful. He had located evidence suggesting that Thomas was preparing updated estate documents. The process was not yet complete, but one detail stood out immediately. A name appeared repeatedly within preliminary records connected to the review. Not mine, not our son's. Diane Carter. I stared at the phone after the call ended. My pulse hammered inside my ears. The money had never been the final destination. It had only been the beginning. And suddenly I realized that whatever Thomas was planning could reach far beyond monthly transfers and hidden accounts. After learning that Diane's name appeared inside documents connected to Thomas's estate planning review, I stopped searching for answers and started preparing for reality. Whatever happened next, I needed facts that could stand on their own. Emotions could wait. Evidence could not. Over the following week, I became more organized than I had ever been in my life. Every statement went into a folder. Every financial record received a date. Every conversation was written down in a notebook that never left my side. Thomas noticed the folders once. He asked whether I was finally tackling old paperwork. I smiled and told him retirement gave me too much free time. He laughed and accepted the explanation without another question. The ease with which he accepted it bothered me. For years, I had shared every concern with him. Now I was living a second life inside the same house. One afternoon, I met Andrew Collins again. This time I carried a thick binder filled with records. He reviewed the material carefully. Occasionally he highlighted a page or made a note. Nearly an hour passed before he leaned back in his chair. "You have done excellent work," he said. "You are no longer dealing with suspicions. You are dealing with a documented pattern." Hearing those words brought unexpected calm. For weeks I had questioned myself, wondered whether I was imagining problems that did not exist. Now the facts spoke for themselves. Before leaving, I asked the question that had haunted me for days. "Do you think Diane knows?" Andrew considered the question carefully. "I do not know," he answered. "And until you have direct proof, do not assume she is part of the deception." The drive home felt different. For the first time, I stopped viewing Diane as an enemy. The truth was that I had never spoken to her. Everything I knew came through records, photographs, and assumptions. The only person whose actions I could verify was Thomas. That realization changed everything. A few days later, an opportunity appeared unexpectedly. Thomas announced he would spend Saturday attending a retirement luncheon with several former colleagues. He would be gone most of the day. The moment he left, I sat at my desk and began reviewing digital records once again. Hours passed. Most of what I found simply confirmed what I already knew. Then I opened an archived folder connected to an old investment account. Buried among routine documents was a scanned letter dated several years earlier. My pulse quickened as I began reading. The letter referenced future planning, long-term commitments, and a desire to honor promises made many years ago. No names appeared on the first page, but at the bottom of the second page was a signature. Thomas Brooks. I continued reading. Halfway through the document, another name appeared. Diane Carter. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The letter suggested that the monthly payments were not temporary assistance at all. They were part of a private arrangement Thomas intended to continue indefinitely. My hands trembled slightly as I set the paper down. For 10 years, I had believed I was building a future with complete information. Instead, major decisions had been made without my knowledge. Yet one detail in the letter disturbed me more than anything else. Thomas wrote that certain plans would only be completed after a specific upcoming date. I checked the calendar attached to the document. The date was less than 3 weeks away. The date on that document stayed in my mind every waking hour. Less than 3 weeks. Whatever Thomas intended to do, he had already set it in motion. The waiting no longer felt passive. It felt dangerous, not because I feared him, but because every day that passed gave him more time to finish plans I knew nothing about. I met with Andrew again and showed him the letter. He read it carefully, page by page, without interruption. When he finally looked up, his expression was measured. "This confirms intent," he said. "It does not tell us everything, but it confirms that these arrangements were never temporary." Hearing the words out loud made something settle inside me. For weeks I had lived between suspicion and certainty. Now that uncertainty was gone, the facts were clear. The only thing left was deciding what to do with them. That weekend, Thomas suggested we host a small dinner to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. Friends could not attend on the actual date, so he proposed an early gathering at a local restaurant overlooking the water. The invitation surprised me. More surprising was how enthusiastically he discussed it. He talked about menu options, guest lists, and seating arrangements as though nothing in our lives had changed. I listened quietly. Then I agreed. If he wanted a dinner, he would have one. Over the following days, I finalized my own preparations. Every financial record was organized. Every transfer documented. Every statement copied and secured. Andrew helped me assemble a timeline stretching back 10 years. Looking at the completed binder was like looking at the skeleton of a hidden life. Dates, amounts, correspondence, decisions. One fact connected to another until the entire story became impossible to deny. Then something unexpected happened. Margaret called late one afternoon. She sounded stunned. Earlier that day, through a mutual acquaintance, she had learned that Diane believed I knew about the arrangement. I nearly dropped the phone. "What do you mean?" I asked. Margaret repeated the conversation. Diane had apparently mentioned that Thomas always handled everything and that she assumed his wife was fully informed. I sat in silence. Suddenly, a dozen confusing details made sense. The confidence, the openness, the absence of secrecy. Whenever Diane appeared in public, perhaps she had never realized she was participating in a deception. Perhaps the lie belonged entirely to Thomas. The realization did not erase the damage, but it changed where I directed my anger. A week later, the anniversary dinner arrived. The restaurant overlooked a quiet marina. Sunlight reflected across the water as guests laughed and exchanged stories. Thomas seemed relaxed, happy even. He greeted friends, ordered wine, and thanked everyone for coming. Several times he squeezed my hand beneath the table. Anyone watching would have seen a devoted husband celebrating decades of marriage. When dessert arrived, Thomas stood to make a short speech. He talked about loyalty, partnership, shared history. The irony was almost unbearable. As he finished, I reached beside my chair and lifted the binder onto the table. The sound it made was surprisingly loud. Conversation stopped. Thomas looked down. His smile faded. I opened the binder to the first page and gently turned it toward him. Across the top was a simple title, 10 Years of Transfers. Beneath it sat every date, every amount, and every piece of evidence I had collected. For the first time since this began, Thomas had no explanation ready. And as I watched the color leave his face, I realized the secret that had lived in darkness for a decade had finally run out of places to hide.